My name is Sarah Whitman, and I live in a small town in Ohio, in a narrow 2-story house that looks exactly like every other house on the street. White siding, a porch that creaks in winter, a backyard that backs into nothing but trees. I moved there 3 years ago with my son Noah, after my husband died suddenly in a car accident. I was 32, newly widowed, and learning how to be a mother and a provider at the same time. During the day, the house felt like ours. At night, it didn't. At first, I blamed grief. People don't talk enough about how grief distorts reality, how it makes your memory unreliable, how it fills ordinary silence with imagined sounds. I was exhausted all the time working remotely, raising a 5-year-old, managing bills, fixing things my husband used to handle. When the night started feeling wrong, I told myself it was stress. That was easier than considering the alternative. The first thing I noticed was the layout. I would go to bed knowing exactly how I'd left the house. I'm meticulous by nature. The front door always locked. The hallway nightlight always on. The kitchen chairs always pushed in. But some mornings, I'd wake up with the uneasy sense that I was walking through a place that only looked like my home. A chair would be slightly angled away from the table. The hallway light would be off, even though I never turned it off at night because Noah was afraid of the dark. The throw blanket on the couch would be folded differently, not messy, not tossed aside, just folded in a way I didn't recognize. Nothing was ever missing. Nothing was broken. It was subtle enough that I questioned myself every time. Noah started noticing things before I did. One morning, while I was pouring cereal, he asked me why I had been up walking after he fell asleep. I laughed and told him I hadn't. I said maybe he'd had a dream. He shook his head and said, very casually, "No, you were walking slow and you didn't turn the lights on." That sentence stayed with me all day. A week later, he asked why I talked differently at night. I asked him what he meant, trying to keep my voice neutral. He said, "You don't talk to me. You just check the doors." That night, after I put him to bed, I sat on the edge of my mattress and stared at the bedroom door for a long time. I didn't feel afraid exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you realize you've forgotten something important, but can't remember what it is? Then came the smell. Some nights, I would wake up to the faint scent of soap, cheap, floral, not the kind I used. It would be strongest near the bathroom and fade by morning. I checked my toiletries, convinced I had accidentally bought something new. I hadn't. I checked the locks. All of them were intact. I installed a basic home security system with door sensors and a motion detector in the living room. It made me feel foolish and dramatic, but also relieved. If something was happening, I would finally know. The system never alerted, but the feeling didn't stop. Instead, it got more specific. I started noticing that things were being prepared, not moved. A mug placed by the sink, clean and ready, though I hadn't used it. The bathroom mirror wiped of fingerprints I knew I'd left behind. The trash taken out on nights I was sure I hadn't gone downstairs. Once, I found Noah's backpack by the front door, packed neatly, even though it was Saturday. When I checked the security log, there was nothing. No entries. No motion detected. I told myself I must be sleepwalking. That explanation almost worked till I found the notebook. It was in the junk drawer in the kitchen. Beneath old batteries and takeout menus, small spiral notebook I didn't recognize. Inside were dates written in careful handwriting. My handwriting, but not my words. Simple observations. Doors checked twice. Child asleep by 9:14. Lights left as found. I stood there for a long time, notebook shaking in my hands. My mind scrambling for a rational explanation. Stress, dissociation, some kind of breakdown. I made an appointment with a therapist that same day. She listened calmly, asked gentle questions, and suggested I might be experiencing a trauma-related sleep disorder. She recommended journaling before bed, grounding exercises, rest. That night, I wrote a note to myself on the kitchen counter in bold marker. I am awake. I am present. I am not leaving my bed. I locked my bedroom door. I don't remember falling asleep. I remember waking up standing in the hallway, barefoot, staring at the front door. The marker note was gone. The door was unlocked. I checked on Noah. He was asleep, breathing softly, his bedroom door wide open, even though he always closed it. On the kitchen counter was a new note, written in the same bold marker. Everything is secure. Go back to bed. The therapist called it dissociation when I told her. She didn't have an answer when I asked why the dissociation seemed to have routines, or why it felt so deliberate. The breaking point came when Noah stopped calling me mom at night. One evening, while I was tucking him in, he asked, "Which one are you?" I laughed too loudly and asked him what he meant. He looked confused. The morning one or the night one? I asked him to explain. He said, "The morning one hugs me. The night one just looks." That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the top of the stairs until dawn, watching the dark swallow the house. Nothing happened. No footsteps. No movement. Just me, listening to my own breathing. In the morning, I found the front door unlocked again. The security system still showed nothing. I finally did what I should have done earlier. I set up a camera in the living room, hidden, not connected to the system. Something separate. I didn't tell anyone. That night, I watched the footage the next morning while Noah was at school. At 1:47 a.m., the camera activated. The woman who came down the stairs was me. Same face, same hair, same body, but the way she moved was different. Slower, purposeful. She checked the locks, adjusted the furniture, stood in the middle of the living room for nearly 5 minutes, just looking around like she was memorizing it. Then she looked directly into the camera, and she smiled not warmly, not cruelly, just satisfied. She went back upstairs at 2:13 a.m. I didn't recognize the expression on my own face. I took Noah and left that day. We stayed with my sister for a week while I tried to decide what to do. Doctors called it a severe dissociative disorder triggered by trauma. They said the other state might believe it was protecting us. That explanation should have comforted me. It didn't. Because a few days later, my sister found a folded blanket on her couch that none of us remembered using. And on the guest room nightstand, there was a notebook. Inside, in my handwriting, were new entries. House, unfamiliar. Child, unsettled. Temporary location. Adaptation required. That's when I realized the truth. I wasn't losing my home at night. I was sharing it. And whatever version of me took over after dark wasn't confused or broken or afraid. She was settling in, and she didn't see the house or my life as mine anymore. My name is Emily Carter, and I live in a modest townhouse in suburban Michigan with my husband, James, and our 6-year-old daughter, Lily. James works in the hospital as a night shift nurse, so he's often gone when the house falls silent, leaving me alone with Lily. I've grown used to the quiet, to the rhythm of our nights, and I thought I knew my home inside out, every creak of the floorboards, every shadow cast by the streetlight outside. Until one night, I realized how little I truly did. It was a Tuesday, late February. James had already left for work, and Lily was tucked into bed after a long bath and story time. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes and humming softly. When I heard the faint sound of the front door handle rattling, my first thought was that it was the wind. We live in a quiet cul-de-sac, and the door is solid. I shrugged it off and finished the dishes. A few minutes later, I realized I hadn't locked the door after letting the trash out. My pulse quickened. I went to the front door and tried the handle. It was already locked. I frowned. I always lock it after going outside, but I could have forgotten in a rush. Still, there was that niggling unease I couldn't shake. I went back to the kitchen, trying to convince myself it was nothing, when I noticed the living room lights were off. I remembered leaving them on. I flipped the switch. Nothing. My heart skipped a beat. I walked toward the hallway and found the lights there also off. The faint sound of the heater humming was the only noise. I called James, but the line went straight to voicemail. Lily stirred upstairs. I forced myself to smile and whispered to her, "Mommy's here. Everything's fine." But the tightening in my chest didn't go away. Something felt off. I checked all the doors and windows. All were locked from the inside, exactly how I'd left them. I even checked the back door, which leads to the small fenced yard, locked. My mind raced, but rationally. Maybe the lock was sticky. Maybe the wind had moved something. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was overthinking it. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that the house wasn't entirely mine at that moment. I felt like a visitor in a familiar space. I went to Lily's room to check on her. She was asleep, curled up in her blanket. Relief washed over me, and I gently kissed her forehead. On my way back to the kitchen, I passed the living room mirror and froze. My reflection was just me, or so I thought. But for a split second, I swore I saw someone else standing behind me. Just a shadow, and then it was gone. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I whispered to myself, "It's fine. It's just shadows. I'm tired." I shut the kitchen lights off and went to the hallway, intending to check the doors one last time before retreating to bed. That's when I noticed the small, almost imperceptible scratch along the edge of the front door frame. It hadn't been there before. My hands trembled as I traced it lightly with my finger. It was too high for Lily to reach, and James was already at work. I couldn't explain it. I double-checked the door handle and lock. Firm. Locked. Nothing else had changed. The sensation of being watched was overwhelming. I texted James frantically, but no response. My phone's battery was low, and I felt trapped. The thought of leaving the house to get signal made my stomach knot. I decided to stay calm and do something I always did when I felt anxious: go through the house methodically. Every room, every closet, every corner. I even checked the attic hatch, which is rarely used. Nothing. All doors and windows still locked. Nothing seemed out of place. But the sense of intrusion lingered, creeping into my mind in ways I couldn't rationalize. It wasn't about what I could sit, it was about what I felt, and that feeling was impossible to ignore. Hours passed. I stayed awake on the couch, Lily asleep in the other room, phone in hand, watching the front door like a hawk. The wind blew outside, rattling the small branches against the windows. Every sound startled me, but nothing explained the locked door. I tried convincing myself I had forgotten to unlock it earlier, that maybe James had stopped by before work and left quietly. But the thought made my stomach churn. Why would he lock me inside? Why not wake me if he was already home? None of it added up. When James returned home the next morning, exhausted and bleary-eyed, I told him what had happened. He listened carefully and nodded, but his face held concern rather than disbelief. "Are you sure it wasn't your phone dying, or just stress?" he asked. I shook my head. No. The door, it was locked from the inside. I didn't lock it. I couldn't get out without a key. Something was in the house with me. He didn't argue, but I could tell he didn't fully understand. Who would? It wasn't tea until I checked the security camera footage later that day that I understood what had really happened. Around 2:14 a.m., the front door handle turned. A shadow passed across the frame. The door didn't open. Whatever it was had managed to lock it from the inside without triggering the sensors. My stomach dropped. The footage was brief, almost imperceptible, but it confirmed my fear. Someone or something had been inside my home, unseen, controlling access, silently observing me while I slept. That night, I stayed awake again, unable to shake the image of that locked door. I realized something that made my chest tighten like it would never relax. The person who had locked the door wasn't a stranger wandering in from the street. It wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Whoever it was had known the layout, the locks, the rhythms of our house, and the most terrifying part. I couldn't be sure it wouldn't happen again. Because it had already happened once in my home, my sanctuary wasn't entirely mine anymore. My name is Laura Mitchell, and I live in a modest suburban home in Connecticut with my husband, Michael, and our 2 children, Ella, 7, and Sam, 5. I've always been a light sleeper, especially since becoming a mother, but I had never been truly afraid of my own home until last winter. That fear wasn't sudden, and it didn't have a clear cause at first. Crept in slowly, almost like a whisper in a house I thought I knew completely. It started one evening after I had tucked the children into bed. I had been folding laundry in the living room, humming softly to myself, when I heard a faint noise coming from the hallway. At first, I thought it was just the pipes, or maybe the wind rattling the window panes. But the sound repeated a soft, high-pitched giggle. I froze, listening. It was coming from the children's bedrooms. My first instinct was to rush in, but I paused, trying to convince myself it was a recording from one of the toys, or perhaps Ella had left a music box playing. I peeked into both rooms. They were dark, quiet, the children deeply asleep. I told myself I was imagining it. Maybe my exhaustion was making me hear things. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat on the couch, straining to listen, but the house was still. After a few minutes, I relaxed, chalking it up to stress. But over the next few nights, the laughter returned. Always faint, almost teasing, always from the direction of the children's rooms. It wasn't playful in the way a child's laugh as it had a hollow, empty quality that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. One night, I decided to record it on my phone. I set it on the kitchen counter, near the hallway, and left it running as I tried to sleep on the couch. At 2:03 a.m., the recording captured it again, a short, stifled laugh. Like someone had been just outside the bedroom doors, careful not to disturb the children. My heart pounded. I walked down the hallway, flashlight in hand, to check. Nothing. Toys were in their usual places, beds untouched, blankets tucked in neatly. It was as if the sound existed without a source. I began sleeping in shifts with the children, checking on them every hour. Sometimes, when I peeked through the slightly ajar door, I would catch a flicker of movement in the shadows, or hear the faint scrape of what could have been a toy falling. Every time the children remained asleep, completely undisturbed, I questioned my sanity. Perhaps I was imagining things, or worse, creating a narrative in my mind because of my own fear and exhaustion. But the laughter was too consistent, too deliberate. I installed a small security camera in the hallway outside the children's bedrooms. I told Michael it was just for peace of mind. He laughed and agreed, calling me overprotective. That night, I watched the footage in real time, sitting tensely on the couch. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the camera captured at a faint figure at the far end of the hallway. I couldn't make out details. Only a dark shape that seemed to shift quickly toward the bedrooms, then vanish. There was no sound captured on the camera, yet the laugh had echoed clearly in the room when I was watching live. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked every window and door. All were locked. The blinds were down. Children's bedroom doors were closed, as usual. Nothing appeared out of place. I tried to rationalize it as my mind playing tricks on me, but the laughter continued for several nights after. Each time it was closer, more insistent, yet the children never woke. Eventually, I realized something horrifying. It wasn't that my home was haunted, or that someone had broken in. It was that the sound existed around the children, undetected, entirely separate from me or anyone else. I didn't know what created it, and I never saw the source clearly, but I could feel it observing, lingering just beyond the edge of my perception. The children remained blissfully unaware, and that was what terrified me most. After weeks of recordings, sleepless nights, and constant anxiety, I finally accepted a disturbing truth. The laughter wasn't random, and it wasn't imagined. It existed in the spaces I thought were safe, silent when adults were present, deliberate when they were not. The home I loved, the rooms I had filled with comfort and care, were no longer entirely mine. Every night, something unseen was there, close enough to touch my children's lives without ever being seen. And I realized the worst part. I could do nothing to stop it. I could only wait every night, listening, hoping it didn't grow bolder. My name is Hannah Lewis, and I live in a modest townhouse in suburban Pennsylvania with my husband, Daniel, and our 9-year-old daughter, Sophie. Daniel works long hours as a financial analyst, often staying late at the office, leaving me alone in the house during the evenings and nights. I've always considered myself a rational person, careful and meticulous about routines. But over the past few months, something started happening in my home. Something I couldn't explain. Something that made the familiar walls feel foreign. It began with small, subtle details. At first, it was just a feeling like someone was watching me while I moved around the house after dark. I would be in the kitchen doing dishes and suddenly feel a chill crawl across my shoulders. The kind that makes you turn quickly, even when no one is there. I blamed stress at first. Daniel said I'd been working too hard, juggling household responsibilities and caring for Sophie. My doctor said the same. Stress and exhaustion. "Try sleeping more, Hannah," she said, "and don't let anxiety take over." I nodded because it was easier than admitting the truth. I had begun seeing something every night, and it was not human. The first night I noticed it clearly. I had stayed up later than usual, finishing paperwork in the living room. Sophie had been asleep for hours, her bedroom door closed, her soft breathing steady. That's when I saw it, at the far end of the hallway. It was a figure, just a shadowy shape at first, moving slowly and deliberately. I froze, heart racing, thinking it might be Daniel, though I knew he wouldn't be home for another 2 hours. The figure didn't move like a human. It was uneven, almost jerky, as if it wasn't walking, but leaning or stretching unnaturally. I blinked and it vanished. After that night, the sightings became regular. Every evening, I would sense it before I saw it. Corner of my eye would catch movement just outside the kitchen doorway. The lights in the hallway seemed dimmer than normal. Sometimes I would hear faint, deliberate footsteps on the stairs, soft. Careful, but every time I checked, the house was empty. Sophie slept through it, untroubled. And that was part of what terrified me most. The presence was patient. It only revealed itself when no one else was awake. I tried to record it, set up cameras, anything to confirm I wasn't imagining things. On the footage, there was always a blur, an unrecognizable silhouette moving through the rooms, sometimes stopping at doorways or near furniture, always gone in a moment. The strange part was how deliberate it seemed. It wasn't chaotic. It wasn't random. It observed, it lingered, and then it moved on. Even the cameras couldn't capture it fully. I began to notice small changes in the house. Objects would be slightly out of place in the morning, though nothing was ever missing or broken. A chair moved a few inches, a blanket folded differently. The sensation of being watched persisted, even during the day, though it was strongest at night. I spoke to Daniel about it, but he laughed it off. "Hannah, maybe it's stress or exhaustion. You've been home a lot lately," he said. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to rationalize it, to convince myself it was all in my head. But seeing it, the figure night after night, left me with no safe space in my own home. One particularly long night, I stayed in Sophie's room, sitting in the rocking chair, pretending to read. I had the baby monitor on, listening for any unusual sound. Around 2 a.m., I saw it again at the corner of the hallway. I could make out vague details this time. No clear face, but an unnatural height and posture. Long limbs that bent at strange angles. It paused, as if studying the room, before slipping silently back toward the kitchen. My hands shook, my chest tight. I called my doctor again, desperate, and she urged me to try therapy and mindfulness exercises. She believed it was stress-induced hallucinations. I wanted desperately to believe that. Over the next few weeks, I documented everything. Every time I saw it, the time, the location, even the movement. It followed patterns always near the children's rooms. Always during the same window of night, always gone before dawn. I began sleeping in shifts, alternating nights with Daniel when he could, but even during the rare nights he was home, it never appeared. Only when I was alone. It was patient, deliberate, almost intelligent in its movements, and always uncatchable. One morning, after a particularly tense night, I noticed something I hadn't before. A small indentation on the carpet near Sophie's bed, like something had knelt there. I traced it lightly with my finger. The depression didn't match anything we owned. The carpet fibers were compressed in a way that suggested weight. Whoever or whatever was entering our home at night had been close enough to Sophie to observe her sleeping. That realization made me nauseous. The presence was not random. It was deliberate, and it wasn't afraid of being seen. I finally understood the truth in a moment of quiet, terrible clarity. It wasn't human, not in the way any person is. But it wasn't some fantastical creature either. It was something mechanical, methodical, calculating. It existed in my home, among our lives, silently, while everyone else slept. It had learned the layout, the patterns, the routines. It wasn't attacking, but it was there, always, studying, waiting. And I realized with chilling certainty that no one, not my husband, not my doctor, would ever see it. Because it had chosen to remain hidden in the quiet hours of the night. Since then, I've lived with the knowledge that my home isn't entirely mine. Every evening, when the lights dim and the children fall asleep, I brace myself for its return. I've tried therapy, grounding exercises, even changing rooms and rearranging furniture. Nothing works. It's always there, waiting in the shadows, watching the ones I love, patient, silent, and impossibly deliberate. And the most horrifying realization, I can't make it leave. Because whatever it is, it knows exactly where it belongs, and it isn't me. We decided to rent a more affordable house than our previous apartment. It was a modest 2-story brick home on a quiet street. A little older than the other houses nearby, but the rent was perfect for us. He handed over the keys with a smile and said the house had been vacant for a few months. That was all we knew, and it seemed harmless at the time. The first few nights were normal enough. Liam slept soundly in his room. Mark and I unpacked slowly, and the house felt like any other home we'd lived in. But soon, subtle things started to feel off. Soft creaks in the hallway, but when I checked, Mark and Liam were both asleep. The noises were irregular, almost casual, as if someone was moving through the house carefully, but with purpose. I brushed it off, blaming the old floorboards and my own imagination. Then came the closet door. One morning, I found the door slightly ajar, even though I had closed it before tucking him in. Nothing had been moved, nothing missing, but the latch looked like it had been handled. I asked Liam if he had opened it during the night. He shook his head, eyes wide and serious. "No, Mom, I was asleep." I told myself it was probably me forgetting, but the unease was growing. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing other things. Items would be subtly out of place, kitchen utensils slightly shifted. A chair moved an inch to the left. The living room lamp angled differently. Nothing was broken or missing, yet I couldn't explain the changes. It was never chaotic or violent, just deliberate. Moving through it when we weren't paying attention. One night, I woke to the sound of soft tapping coming from the basement. I knew no one else was home. Mark was working late. Liam was asleep in his room. I debated ignoring it, but the tapping grew persistent, where the water heater hummed quietly. They weren't large, and they weren't entirely human-shaped. The outline seemed wrong. The breaking point came when I finally spoke to Mr. Halstead. I mentioned the noises, the movement, the strange feeling in the house. His face went pale. He hesitated, then muttered something about the previous tenants and quickly changed the subject. That night, I couldn't sleep. A week later, I discovered the hidden room. It was behind the basement shelves, a small crawl space Mr. Halstead had neglected to mention, some forming paths toward the main basement stairs. In the corner, I found remnants of personal belongings, old clothing, a child's toy, photographs, and a journal. It belonged to someone who had clearly lived there, quietly, without anyone knowing. The writing was sporadic, fearful, describing a life trapped in observation, watched constantly. I realized then the terrible truth. Mr. Halstead had not told us everything about the house. Someone had lived there, unseen, hidden within the walls or the basement, moving silently when the house was occupied. The noises, the movements, the subtle shifts, they weren't caused by ghosts or my imagination. Now, every night, I hear faint sounds from the basement, soft movements in the shadows. I check on Liam repeatedly, and yet, the house never stops feeling like it has another presence, deliberate, patient, watching. The realization is simple, but horrifying. Our home was not as empty as we were told. Something unseen has already claimed part of it, quietly, waiting, and we are only visitors. My name is Claire Donovan, and I live in a small townhouse in suburban New Jersey with my husband, Adam, and our 7-year-old son, Jamie. Adam works late nights several times a week at the hospital, so it's often just me at home in the evenings. I've always considered our home a safe place. The kind of house where you can lock the doors, turn on the lights, and feel completely protected. Until that night, it started as a normal Tuesday. Adam had left for work around 8, and Jamie was asleep after a long day of school and soccer practice. I was alone in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, listening to soft music on my phone. The house was quiet. The kind of quiet that usually makes you relax. I put away the last plate and washed my hands when I heard it. My name, soft, familiar. From somewhere nearby, Claire. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I knew I hadn't called out. Jamie was asleep in his room. Adam was gone. I looked around the kitchen. The lights were on. The doors locked, everything exactly as I had left it. I told myself it was my imagination. Maybe I had muttered my own name while washing dishes. I laughed nervously and went to check on Jamie. His bedroom door was closed, and he was breathing evenly. Nothing seemed wrong. I returned to the kitchen, still uneasy, and tried to focus on cleaning. But the sound came again. Claire. Louder this time, almost coaxing. I couldn't ignore it. My stomach twisted as I realized the voice had come from somewhere inside the house. I moved slowly toward the hallway, straining my ears. The house felt suddenly unfamiliar, each shadow seeming to stretch and shift as I walked past. I checked all the doors, the windows, even the locks. Everything was secure. Over the next few nights, the same thing happened. The voice wasn't continuous, but it was deliberate. Timed when I was alone, always soft, always just close enough to make me spin around. Sometimes it seemed to come from the living room, sometimes from the kitchen, sometimes from the hallway outside Jamie's room. The sound was never harsh or threatening, just intimate, familiar, almost like someone was right there with me, calling me into the quiet. I tried to rationalize it. Stress, maybe, exhaustion, perhaps sleepwalking. I even considered talking to a therapist. But each night, the voice came back in the same precise way, from the same indistinct place. Always when the house was dark and I was alone. I started keeping a small recorder running in the kitchen, hoping to capture the source. Each morning, the playback revealed nothing, just silence, normal household noises, the hum of the refrigerator. One night, I stayed awake in Jamie's room, sitting in the rocking chair, pretending to read. Around 1:47 a.m., I heard the sound again. Claire. This time, I could almost feel it, like a presence just behind me, leaning against the air. I held my breath and stayed very still. After a few minutes, the sound faded. My pulse was racing. and my hands were shaking. I called Adam, leaving a trembling voicemail. He didn't answer. The final straw came when I decided to check the hallway security camera the next morning. I had set it up weeks earlier, just in case, and had almost forgotten it was there. I reviewed the footage from the previous night. There was nothing, no movement, no shadows, no intruder. And yet, I remembered clearly the sound of my name being spoken, close and deliberate. My rational mind screamed that I had imagined it, that stress and fatigue had finally gotten the best of me. But something deep inside told me I hadn't. It took me days to piece together the quiet, terrifying truth. The house was secure. The locks were intact. The doors hadn't been opened. The sound wasn't human, not in the sense of anyone living, breathing, or walking inside. And yet, it was there, present, intimate, deliberate, aware of my solitude. It was patient, waiting until the house was empty, except for me. I realized then that my home, the place I had always trusted, where I felt safe with my family, wasn't entirely mine when I was alone. Something unseen had learned the rhythms of our lives, had learned when I would be alone, had learned to call me by name. And the most terrifying part, it didn't need to show itself. It didn't need to touch anything, move anything, or make a sound the cameras could capture. It only needed to exist in the quiet, watching, speaking, waiting for the right moment. From that night on, I never felt truly alone in the house. Every creak, every settling of the floorboards, every faint rustle of the curtains made me tense. And the knowledge settled in me like a cold weight. Something knew my name, knew when I would be alone, and it didn't belong to the world I understood. My home had a presence I could not see, and I could not make it leave. My name is Sophie Reynolds, and I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Illinois with my husband, David, and our 7-year-old daughter, Emma. Emma has always been bright and talkative, curious about everything and eager to share her thoughts. But a few months ago, something began to change in ways I couldn't immediately explain. It started with the conversations she seemed to have while she was supposed to be playing alone in her bedroom. At first, I thought it was normal. Children often have imaginary friends, I reminded myself. Emma would sit on the floor, toys spread around her, and speak to someone I couldn't see. "Yes, I'll bring it tomorrow," she would say. Or, "No, you can't come now," her tone surprisingly serious. I laughed quietly at first, thinking it was a phase. But the more it happened, the more uneasy I felt. Her sentences were coherent, precise, sometimes even argumentative, as though she were speaking to a person who could respond. One evening, I decided to sit outside her bedroom door and listen. Emma was on the floor, quietly talking. "I don't want to do that," she said. "You promised you'd wait." There was a pause, and then she whispered, "Okay, I'll wait," as if someone had answered her. The pause made my stomach tighten. I knocked lightly on the door. "Emma, who are you talking to?" Her face lit up in a smile. "Mom, it's just Lily," she said. I frowned. "Lily, who's that?" Emma shrugged. "She's my friend. She's always here." I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was an imaginary friend, a normal part of childhood. But Emma began mentioning things that didn't make sense. "Lily says we can't go into the basement tonight," she said one afternoon. "She said there's someone watching." I had to check. The basement was empty. The windows were locked. No one had been there. I asked Emma if she was scared. She shook her head. "No, Mom. Lily says it's okay. She's just making sure we're safe." The conversations became more detailed over the following weeks. Emma would talk about things that had happened in the house that no one else knew about. "Lily says the back door was open last night," she told me one morning. "I checked the door, locked, exactly as it should have been." "She said someone left the lights on in the living room," Emma added. "I went to see. The lamp was on. I hadn't turned it on." I began to feel a creeping sense of dread, a weight I couldn't explain. I installed a small camera in Emma's room to try and understand what was happening. One night, I watched the footage carefully. Emma was sitting cross-legged on her bed, speaking in her usual calm, serious tone. But the room was empty. No one was there. The camera picked up nothing except her talking to someone I could not see. Every time I replayed the footage, I felt a sinking sensation in my chest. The presence she spoke to was invisible to everyone but her. I spoke to Emma about it one evening, hoping for clarity. "Emma, does anyone come here when I'm not home?" She looked confused. "No, Mom, it's just Lily." I asked what Lily looked like. "She doesn't look like anyone. She's just there." My mind raced. The rational part of me searched for a solution therapist, psychologist. Stressed but my heart refused to ignore the evidence in front of me. Emma's calm certainty made the rationalizations impossible. Over time, I noticed subtle effects on the household. The temperature in Emma's room seemed colder at night, and I sometimes heard faint murmurs when passing her door. Nothing alarming, nothing I could catch, just soft enough to unsettle me. Emma continued talking as if someone were answering her, moving in her small routines, negotiating plans with someone invisible. Her world had a layer I could not access, and it frightened me more than anything I had ever imagined. Finally, one night, Emma whispered as she drifted off to sleep, "Lily says it's time to go now. She'll be back tomorrow." I lay in the hallway, listening, and realized the most terrifying truth. Whatever or whoever Emma was talking to had no physical presence, no material form, but it knew the rhythms of our lives. The layout of the house, our habits, our schedules. It existed only in the quiet, in the space between our awareness, observing through the child who could perceive it. And the thought made my chest tighten. I could not protect her from it. I could not see it. I could not reason with it. I came to accept a bitter reality. My daughter was not alone in the house, even when no one else was home. The presence she communicated with was patient, precise, invisible, and entirely undetectable to anyone else. And the most chilling realization of all, it wasn't malicious. It simply existed, quietly shaping the household from the margins, and I had no way to remove it. The home I thought was ours, the sanctuary I had built for my family, was shared with something beyond my perception, and I could not change that. My name is Jessica Harper, and I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Michigan with my husband, Tom, and our 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Tom works late shifts at the hospital several nights a week, which often leaves me alone in the house after Lily goes to bed. I've always felt safe in our home. The kind of house where you can lock every door, draw the curtains, and know that nothing unexpected should happen. But one night changed that certainty entirely. It was a Wednesday, around 2 a.m. I had just checked on Lily and made sure the doors and windows were locked. I was sitting on the living room couch, scrolling through my phone, when the doorbell rang. At first, I thought I had misheard, was unusually late, and there was no reason anyone should be here. I froze, listening. Again, a sharp chime echoed through the quiet house. My heart began to pound. I whispered Lily's name softly, reassured myself she was asleep and safe in her room. I grabbed my phone and immediately checked the live feed from our front door camera. The screen showed nothing. No one on the porch, no shadow moving across the walkway, no vehicle in the driveway. Just the empty street, bathed in the yellow light from the street lamp. I watched for a few moments, holding my breath, thinking maybe it was a glitch or a stray animal, but the doorbell had stopped. I waited, hoping it wouldn't ring again, my pulse still racing. Minutes later, it rang again. 2:03 a.m. this time. I got up cautiously and walked toward the door. Peeking through the peephole. Nothing. Empty porch. Empty driveway. The camera still showed no one. I whispered to myself, trying to rationalize it may be the wind triggered a faulty sensor. Maybe a delivery drone, maybe even a prank by neighborhood kids. But nothing in me felt convinced. The sound of the chime had been clear, deliberate, and right outside my door. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. Every minor creak, every hum of the refrigerator, every soft settling of the house made me flinch. I checked the locks again, walked through each room, even checked the basement doors. Everything was exactly as it should be. The house was secure. Lily slept peacefully in her bed, breathing evenly, unaware of my growing fear. Over the next few nights, the doorbell incident replayed in my mind obsessively. I couldn't shake the sense that someone or something had been at the edge of my awareness, deliberately present but entirely unseen. I began sleeping with my phone in hand, keeping the camera feed running, trying to catch a sign of movement. Yet every time the chime rang in my mind or in reality, the screen remained empty, silent, void. One night, I decided to record every sound with a voice-activated recorder placed near the living room door. Around 2 a.m., the chime sounded again. I froze and later replayed the recording. There was nothing. No footsteps, no movement, no ambient sound. Just silence. My rational mind argued that maybe I had imagined it, that exhaustion or stress was playing tricks on me. But the sharpness of the sound, the way it jolted me from sleep, told me otherwise. It had been real. The breaking point came when I realized the pattern. The doorbell only rang when I was alone with Lily. Tom being home prevented it. The timing was precise. It was always between 2 and 2:15 a.m., long after Lily was asleep in the deadest part of the night. Whoever or whatever was doing it knew our routines, knew when the house was empty of adults except me. It was deliberate, patient, observing. Weeks later, I finally spoke to Tom about it in detail. He suggested perhaps a malfunction in the wiring or a prank. But I could tell from his face he thought I was overthinking, yet I couldn't let it go. The most disturbing realization hit me one night as I sat on the couch, waiting, phone in hand. It didn't matter if anyone saw it or if it left traces. The presence at our door was real, invisible, and fully aware of me, of my family, of our habits. It didn't need to be seen to be threatening. It only needed to exist quietly at the threshold of my home, aware that I was powerless to stop it. Since that night, I live with the knowledge that our home is not entirely safe, that the quietest part of the night can be watched without any physical signs, and that the doorbell could ring again at 2 a.m., with nothing visible, nothing audible, and yet with me fully aware that something is there. And the most horrifying truth, I realized I will never know what it wants or when it will return, but I will always know it is there, waiting just beyond the camera's sight, beyond anyone else's perception. My name is Emily Carter, and for a long time, I truly believed I was losing my mind. I was 36 years old, a mother, a wife, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Ohio, USA. From the outside, my life looked calm and ordinary. Inside our small house, though, something was slowly breaking me down, piece by piece, without making a sound. It began with little things that were easy to ignore. I would place my phone on the kitchen counter before bed and find it somewhere else in the morning. I would lock the back door, sometimes checking it twice, only to wake up and find it unlocked. Each time, I blamed myself. I told myself I was tired, distracted, overwhelmed by motherhood and routine. As the weeks passed, the house started to feel different at night. Once my son Noah was asleep and my husband Daniel was working late, the silence felt heavy instead of peaceful. I often had the sense that I wasn't truly alone, even though I could see every room was empty. It wasn't fear at first, it was discomfort, like being watched without proof. I started doubting my own memory. I would write notes to myself just to stay grounded. Lock the door at 11:12 p.m. Put Noah's bag by the front door. But the notes didn't protect me. The door would be unlocked again. The bag would somehow return to his room. The more I tried to control things, the more unstable I felt. Sleep became difficult. Almost every night, I woke up suddenly around the same time, my heart racing, convinced someone was standing in the hallway. I never saw anyone, just the feeling of presence. I checked on Noah constantly, needing to reassure myself that at least he was safe and real. I tried to talk to Daniel about it, but I stopped when I saw the concern in his eyes. He suggested stress, anxiety, maybe talking to a professional. My therapist was kind and logical. She talked about exhaustion and anxiety, about how the mind fills gaps when we're overwhelmed. I wanted to believe her. It was easier than believing something was wrong inside my home. Then I found something I couldn't explain. While folding laundry one afternoon, I discovered a gray hoodie that didn't belong to anyone in our family. It was too large for me, too small for Daniel, and it smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. Neither of us smoked. When I asked Daniel about it, he laughed nervously and suggested it must belong to a guest. But we hadn't had visitors in weeks. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Around 2 a.m., I heard a slow creak in the hallway. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't imagined. It was deliberate. I sat up in bed, frozen, listening as the sound moved closer. My first thought wasn't that someone had broken in. It was that my mind had finally snapped. I stepped into the hallway and noticed Noah's bedroom door was open. I knew I had closed it. His room was empty, his bed neatly made. Panic set in immediately, sharp and physical. I searched the house in silence, calling his name under my breath, until I heard a sound coming from the basement, quiet adult cough. The basement light was on. Sitting at our dining table was a man I had never seen before, calmly drinking from one of our mugs. Noah was asleep on the couch beside him, wrapped in a blanket. The man looked at me without surprise and said softly, "You weren't supposed to see me." The police later told us he had been living inside our house for nearly 3 months. He entered through a loose basement window we didn't know existed. He memorized our routines, waited until we slept, and moved things just enough to make me doubt myself. The hoodie was his. Everything I blamed on my mind was intentional. What stays with me isn't just what he did, it's what he said. During questioning, he admitted he chose me because he knew I would question myself before questioning reality. He said women like me always assume they're the problem. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't going crazy. But now, even though he's gone, I still wake up in the middle of the night listening to the quiet house. Because once your trust in yourself is broken, it doesn't return as Leon. That realization is the most disturbing thing of all. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for a long time, my husband told me everything I was experiencing was just my imagination. We lived in a modest 2-story house in a quiet town in northern England, the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen. I was a mother, a wife, and someone who trusted her home. That trust didn't disappear all at once. It eroded slowly, late at night, when no one else was listening. It began shortly after we moved in. The house was old, but well-maintained, with wooden floors that creaked in places you'd expect. At first, the sounds felt normal. Pipes knocking, the wind brushing against the windows, the house settling into itself. I had lived in older buildings before, so I didn't panic. I told myself this house was simply learning our routine. But then the sounds changed. Late at night, after our daughter Lily was asleep and my husband, Mark, had drifted off beside me, I would hear something faint but deliberate. Soft footsteps, not hurried, not heavy, just slow movement along the upstairs hallway. Every time I held my breath and listened, trying to convince myself it was nothing. When I finally mentioned it to Mark, he smiled gently and told me it was probably the house settling. He said I was overtired, that motherhood had made me hyper-aware. He wasn't dismissive, just confident. That somehow made it worse. It made me question myself. The noises didn't happen every night, which made them harder to explain. Sometimes days passed in silence. Then, without warning, I'd hear the same sound again. A pause, a step, another pause. Always after midnight. always when the house was otherwise quiet. I started checking on Lily obsessively. Her door was always closed when I put her to bed, but sometimes when I woke in the middle of the night, I'd find it slightly open. Mark insisted I must have checked on her and forgotten. I wanted to believe him. Forgetting felt safer than the alternative. Soon, it wasn't just sounds. Small things began to feel off. Cabinets left ajar. The living room curtains not fully closed the way I always left them. Once I found the back door unlocked in the morning. Mark swore he hadn't used it. I told myself I must have. That was the most frightening part, how quickly I learned to blame myself. Mark remained calm through all of it. Suggested stress, hormones, anxiety. He told me kindly that fear could make ordinary things feel threatening. I nodded, even as something inside me tightened every night when the lights went out. The house felt different after dark. Not hostile, just alert. Like it was awake when we weren't. One night, I heard something new. A soft dragging sound coming from downstairs. It was slow, controlled, as if someone were being careful not to make noise. I lay still, my heart pounding, staring at the ceiling. Mark slept beside me, breathing evenly. The next morning, I told him everything. He listened, then sighed and said the word I had begun to hate. Imagination. He suggested I stop reading scary stories before bed and focus on rest. I smiled and agreed, but inside, something shifted. I stopped asking him to believe me. Instead, I started listening more carefully. I stayed up later. I memorized the normal sounds of the house, the heating system, the refrigerator. The way the floor sounded when someone walked normally. What I heard at night didn't match any of it. Weeks passed. I became tired in a deeper way, not just sleepy, but worn down. I felt isolated in my own home, trapped between fear and self-doubt. Then one night, everything changed. It was just after 1 a.m. when I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they didn't stop. They moved from the far end of the hallway toward our bedroom. I reached for Mark's arm, shaking slightly. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. He stirred, annoyed, and started to say no until the sound came again. Clear, slow, real. We both sat up. The footsteps stopped right outside our door. Mark held his breath. I could feel his body tense beside me. For the first time, I saw something change in his expression. The certainty, the confidence, gone. The sound moved away, down the stairs. Mark got up without a word and opened the bedroom door. The hallway was empty. The house was dark and silent, but we both knew what we had heard. There was no laughter, no explanation, no attempt to dismiss it this time. We searched the house together. Doors were locked, windows closed. Nothing was out of place. Mark didn't speak much after that. He just told me to lock the bedroom door and try to sleep. We didn't. The next day, Mark installed cameras inside and out. He told me it was just for peace of mind, but I could tell he was unsettled. That night, we watched the camera feed before going to bed. Everything looked normal. At 2:14 a.m., one of the indoor cameras recorded movement. It wasn't dramatic, just a shadow passing through the living room. Slow, purposeful, like someone who knew the layout of the house well. The police came the next morning. What they found wasn't supernatural or unbelievable. It was worse. A man had been entering our home through a poorly sealed crawl space beneath the stairs. He had been watching us for weeks, maybe longer. Moving through the house when he was certain we were asleep, learning our routines, testing how much he could get away with. The sounds, the open doors, the footsteps, they were never in my head. When Mark apologized, it was quiet and heavy. He told me he should have listened sooner. I told him the truth, that the hardest part wasn't being scared. It was being told my fear wasn't real. We moved out not long after. Even now, years later, I still wake up at night when I hear the smallest noise. And I understand something I didn't before. Sometimes the most dangerous thing ice and tea, the sound in the dark. It's how easily someone you trust can convince you not to believe your own ears. My name is Laura Bennett, and this happened when my children were still small. We were living in a rented house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood in upstate New York, USA. During the day, the house felt ordinary, almost dull. Toys on the floor, laundry in baskets, the constant noise of children filling every room. But once the kids were asleep, the house felt like it changed, like it finally had the freedom to breathe. It started not long after we moved in. Every night followed the same routine: dinner, homework, baths, bedtime stories. By 9 o'clock, both of my children were asleep in their rooms upstairs. My husband, Andrew, often worked late, leaving me alone in the house for several hours. I looked forward to that quiet at first. It felt like the only time I could hear myself think. The moment the house settled into silence, though, I noticed how alive it sounded. The floorboards shifted under slow, uneven pressure. Doors clicked softly, not opening, just reacting to something passing by. At first, I told myself it was normal on an old house, adjusting to temperature changes. I had lived in enough older homes to know they made noise, but these sounds felt different. They had rhythm. I would sit on the couch with the television on low, listening as the noises moved from one part of the house to another, not randomly, methodically. It felt as though the house was being walked through, not occupied, just explored. Every sound made me pause, waiting to hear what would come next. I checked on the children constantly. Their doors were always closed when I put them to bed, but some nights I found them open just a few inches. I blamed myself. I told myself I must have gone in to check on them and forgotten. That explanation worked until it started happening almost every night. I mentioned it to Andrew, but he wasn't concerned. He said houses sound different at night when everything else is quiet. He reminded me that I was alone more often than he was, that silence could play tricks on the mind. I didn't argue. I didn't want to sound dramatic. The noises became more specific. Cabinet doors lightly tapping closed. The soft scrape of something being moved across the kitchen counter. Once, I heard the clear sound of a chair shifting on the dining room floor. I stayed perfectly still, listening, telling myself that if I moved, I would somehow make it worse. The most unsettling part was how calm everything felt. There was no rushing, no panic, no sudden movements. Whatever was making the sounds was careful, patient, that made it harder to dismiss. I started staying up later, afraid to go to bed while the house was still awake. Some nights, I sat in the dark living room, lights off, just listening. I memorized the usual sounds: the heating system, the refrigerator, the distant traffic. The things I was hearing didn't match any of them. One night, after midnight, I heard footsteps on the stairs. They were slow and controlled, stopping on every other step. I held my breath, staring at the staircase from the couch. The sound reached the bottom and paused. Then it moved across the living room directly behind me. I didn't turn around. I don't know how long I sat there before the house went quiet again. When Andrew came home later that night, I told him everything. He finally listened, but he still didn't seem convinced. He suggested installing better locks and maybe having someone inspect the house. I agreed, but I knew locks wouldn't explain what I was hearing inside. A few nights later, I woke to the sound of my youngest child crying. I rushed to her room and found her standing in her doorway, wide-eyed and shaking. She told me she heard someone walking in the hallway after bedtime. I didn't tell her she was imagining it. I carried her back to bed and stayed with her until she fell asleep. That was the first time I allowed myself to believe something was truly wrong. The truth came out unexpectedly. One afternoon, while cleaning out a storage closet near the back of the house, I found a narrow panel that didn't match the rest of the wall. It opened into a crawl space I didn't know existed. Inside were food wrappers, a flashlight, and a folded blanket. Someone had been living inside our house. The police later confirmed that a man had been accessing the crawl space through an exterior vent hidden behind overgrown bushes. He came out only at night, after the house went quiet. He knew exactly when the children were asleep. He knew when I was alone. The house didn't come alive after my children went to bed, was never asleep to begin with. Even now, in a different home, I can't fully relax once the house grows quiet. Because I learned the hardest truth too late sometimes. The safest moments in your day are the loud ones. And silence is when everything starts watching.